The twin suns cast long shadows across the wheat fields of Kepler 442b, their golden light dancing through the stalks like whispered promises of harvest. Marcus Chun knelt in the rich soil, his weathered hands examining the grain with the reverence of a man who understood that civilization was built on such simple foundations. The colony of New Eden stretched before him, a tapestry of green fields, crystal-clear streams, and homes that gleamed white against the azure sky. "Dad, look!" His daughter Lily, barely 8 years old, ran toward him with her arms outstretched, chasing one of the native butterfly birds that shimmered in the afternoon light. Her laughter echoed across the fields like music, and Marcus felt his heart swell with the kind of contentment that came from knowing his children would inherit a world of peace. In the distance, the soft hum of atmosphere processors maintained the perfect balance of oxygen and nitrogen that made this world a second Earth. 3 generations of colonists had transformed this barren planet into humanity's crown jewel, a testament to what could be achieved when mankind chose to build rather than destroy. "The yields are up another 12%, Marcus told his wife Elena as she approached with their infant son sleeping in her arms. "At this rate, we'll be able to support another 1,000 families by next season." Elena smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Director Walsh was right. This really is humanity's new beginning. Above them, the colony's orbital defense platform drifted silently through the atmosphere, a small constellation of monitoring stations that had never detected anything more threatening than a solar flare. New Eden had been humanity's first attempt at true interstellar colonization, and its success had inspired a dozen other worlds to follow suit. They were farmers, teachers, engineers, and dreamers who had traveled 47 light-years to prove that humanity could transcend its violent past. They had no idea that their peace was about to be shattered by something far more terrible than any war they had ever known. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the pediatric ward of New Eden's Central Hospital, her stethoscope cold against the chest of a young boy who had scraped his knee while playing in the colony's botanical gardens. The injury was minor, the kind of everyday accident that filled her days with purpose rather than crisis. In the 30 years since the colony's founding, she had delivered over 200 babies, treated countless minor injuries, and had rarely seen anything more serious than a broken bone. "There you go, Tommy," she said, applying a BioSeal bandage that would heal the wound within hours. "But maybe next time, don't try to climb trees that are twice your height." The boy grinned and ran off to rejoin his friends, his parents thanking her with the kind of gratitude that came from a community where every life was precious. Through the hospital's large windows, she could see the colony's children playing in the central plaza, their voices carrying on the warm breeze that swept down from the northern mountains. Sarah had been a combat medic during the border wars on Earth, back when humanity was still trying to learn the difference between expansion and conquest. She had seen enough blood and death to last several lifetimes, which was why she had volunteered for the New Eden colony. Here, her hands saved lives through healing, not through frantically trying to stop bleeding in the mud of some forgotten battlefield. Her wrist communicator chirped softly, and she glanced down to see a message from her husband, Major James Mitchell, who commanded the colony's small security force. Asterisk, all quiet here. Dinner at 7? Asterisk. She smiled and typed back. Asterisk wouldn't miss it. Love you. Asterisk. The last message she would ever send. Major James Mitchell stood on the observation deck of the colony's command center, watching the sun set over a world that had known only peace. His security force consisted of 30 men and women whose primary responsibilities involved managing wildlife, responding to natural disasters, and occasionally settling disputes between neighbors. They were peace officers in the truest sense, protectors of a society that had moved beyond the need for warriors. "Sir," Lieutenant Rodriguez approached with a data pad, "the quarterly security report is ready for your review." James accepted the pad and scanned the statistics. 0 violent crimes, 3 minor accidents, 1 missing person who had been found safe after getting lost during a hiking expedition. It was the kind of report that would have been unthinkable on Earth, where millions still died in resource wars and territorial disputes. "Send it to Director Walsh," he said, "and schedule the next community safety meeting for her." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing the command center in red light, but James's blood had already turned to ice. In 30 years of service, he had never seen a complete power failure. New Eden's fusion reactors were protected by multiple redundancies, and the colony's infrastructure was designed to withstand everything from solar storms to seismic activity. "Rodriguez, give me a status report on all primary systems," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in actual combat. "Sir, we're reading massive electromagnetic interference from orbit," the communications officer reported. "All satellite links are down." James moved to the central display, where a schematic of the colony's layout flickered with warning indicators. His training kicked in. The same instincts that had kept him alive during the border wars were screaming that this was not a system failure. This was an attack. "Sound general quarters," he commanded. "All security personnel to battle stations. Activate the emergency broadcast system." "Sir, we don't have battle stations," Rodriguez reminded him. "This is a civilian colony." James stared at the display, watching as more systems went offline. For the first time in 30 years, he wished he had been wrong about humanity's capacity for peace. Chief Engineer Elena Vasquez stood in the central power plant, her hands dancing across holographic displays that showed the colony's entire infrastructure network. She had designed many of the systems herself, taking pride in creating technology that served life rather than destroying it. The fusion reactors hummed with quiet efficiency, providing clean, unlimited energy to the 40,000 souls who called New Eden home. "The new water purification system is operating at 102% efficiency," her assistant reported. "The mineral extraction filters are exceeding all projections." Elena nodded, making notes on her tablet. Every system in the colony was integrated, designed to work in harmony with the planet's natural ecosystem. They had learned from Earth's mistakes, creating a civilization that enhanced rather than exploited the world around them. She had been a weapons designer during the border wars, creating increasingly sophisticated methods of destruction. But here on New Eden, she had found redemption in building systems that preserved life. The atmosphere processors that maintained perfect air quality, the fusion reactors that provided unlimited clean energy, the quantum computers that managed the colony's infrastructure, all of it represented humanity's better angels. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority message, and Elena smiled as she saw it was from her daughter, who worked as a teacher in the colony's school system. "Asterisk, Mom, the kids want to know if you can give another presentation about the terraforming process. They're fascinated by how we made the planet habitable." Asterisk. Elena started to type a response, but the words never appeared on her screen. Instead, the display flickered and went dark, along with every other system in the power plant. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and for a moment, Elena experienced the kind of terror she had not felt since the last days of the border wars. Then the building shook, and she knew that the universe had not forgotten how to make war. Director Catherine Walsh stood in her office, reviewing the monthly reports that painted a picture of humanity's greatest achievement. New Eden was more than a colony. It was proof that mankind could transcend its violent nature and build something worthy of the stars. The agricultural yields were up, the birth rate was healthy, and the cultural development programs were flourishing. Children born on New Eden would grow up knowing only peace, only the satisfaction of building rather than destroying. "Director," her aide knocked on the door, "you have a call from the Interstellar Development Council. They want to discuss the applications for the new colony sites." Catherine smiled. 12 other worlds were waiting to follow New Eden's example, each one representing another step away from humanity's blood-soaked past. The species that had once turned Earth into a battlefield was finally learning to be gardeners instead of conquerors. She was reaching for the communicator when the lights went out. Years of political experience had taught her to recognize the difference between a crisis and a catastrophe, and the quality of silence that followed the power failure told her everything she needed to know. This was not a technical malfunction. This was something far worse. The emergency lighting activated, and her aide burst through the door, his face pale with terror. "Director, Major Mitchell is on emergency frequency. He says we're under attack." Catherine felt the bottom drop out of her world. Attack? New Eden had no enemies. Humanity had not encountered another intelligent species in all their years of expansion. The galaxy was supposed to be empty except for them. "Give me a colony-wide broadcast," she ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her chest. "And contact Earth. Tell them." The building shook as something massive struck it from above, and Catherine realized that Earth was 47 light-years away. Whatever was happening, they were entirely alone. The first sign of the Zephyrian attack fleet was not visual. It was the sudden failure of every electronic system in the colony as their quantum disruptors swept through New Eden's infrastructure like a digital plague. The second sign was the shadows that fell across the city as their ships blotted out the sun. Marcus Chun was still in his wheat field when the sky turned dark. He looked up to see vessels of impossible size descending through the atmosphere, crystalline structures that seemed to bend light around them, their surfaces reflecting the terror in his eyes. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, and Marcus felt his evolutionary instincts scream warnings that his rational mind could not process. "Lily!" he shouted, but his daughter was already running toward him, her face streaked with tears as she pointed at the sky. "Daddy, what are those?" Marcus swept her into his arms, his farmer's hands trembling as he held her close. Around them, other colonists were emerging from their homes, their faces turned upward in confusion and growing horror. These were people who had never seen a warship, never imagined that such vessels could exist. The Zephyrian ships hung in the sky like monuments to destruction, their surfaces shimmering with energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate. They had traveled across the galaxy to this remote world, drawn by electromagnetic signatures that indicated a thriving human civilization. To them, New Eden was not a peaceful colony of farmers and dreamers. It was a strategic asset to be claimed and a potential threat to be eliminated. The first lance of energy struck the colony's central plaza, vaporizing the fountain where children had played only moments before. The blast wave shattered windows for miles around, and Marcus felt the heat wash over him like the breath of a dragon. The second blast struck the school, the third hit the hospital, and the fourth obliterated the administrative complex where Director Walsh had spent her final moments trying to call for help. In the space of 30 seconds, the Zephyrians had destroyed everything that represented human civilization on New Eden. But they were not finished. They had come to harvest, not merely to destroy, and the true horror was only beginning. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was thrown to the floor as the hospital shook around her, ceiling tiles raining down like concrete snow. The emergency generators had failed along with everything else, and the only light came from the fires that were beginning to consume the building. Through the smoke, she could see her patients, children and elderly colonists who had trusted her to keep them safe, trapped beneath debris and crying out in pain. "Everyone who can walk, help me get the others out," she shouted, her combat medic training overriding her terror. She pulled a young boy from beneath a collapsed bed, checking him for injuries even as explosions continued to thunder outside. "We need to get to the emergency shelter." But there was no emergency shelter. New Eden had been built by people who believed that war was a relic of humanity's past, and they had never imagined that they might need to defend themselves against anything more dangerous than a solar storm. Through the hospital's broken windows, she could see the Zephyrian ground forces deploying. They moved like liquid mercury, their forms shifting and flowing as they spread through the colony streets. Some appeared humanoid, others resembled geometric shapes that defied description, but all of them moved with the purposeful efficiency of a species that had perfected the art of conquest. The first human they encountered was Tom Bradley, a shopkeeper who had run outside to look for his wife. Sarah watched in horror as the Zephyrians surrounded him, their forms flowing together into a single entity that seemed to absorb him completely. His scream was cut short, but but she could still see his face pressed against the alien's translucent surface, his eyes wide with terror as he was digested alive. "Oh God," she whispered, understanding at last what the Zephyrians had come for. They weren't here to conquer New Eden. They were here to harvest it. Every human being on the planet was nothing more than raw material to be processed. She picked up a piece of rebar from the debris, its weight familiar in her hands. 30 years ago, she had sworn an oath to do no harm, but watching the Zephyrians move through the colony like a plague of locusts, she realized that sometimes the greatest harm came from failing to fight back. Major James Mitchell stood in the ruins of the command center, his service pistol in his hand and 30 rounds of ammunition in his belt. It was pathetic armament against an alien species that could bend space and time to their will, but it was all he had. Around him, the surviving members of his security force had formed a defensive perimeter, their hunting rifles and civilian-grade weapons trained on the approaching Zephyrians. "Sir, we can't hold them," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, his voice tight with controlled terror. "They're not using weapons. They're eating our people alive." James had seen the reports from the other sectors. The Zephyrians didn't kill quickly or cleanly. They absorbed their victims, breaking them down on a molecular level while keeping them conscious throughout the process. It was a fate worse than death, and he would not allow it to happen to his people. "We're not trying to win," he said, checking his weapon. "We're trying to buy time for the civilians to escape." "Escape to where, sir?" "The whole colony is surrounded." James looked out at the burning city, at the thousands of Zephyrians that moved through the streets like a living tide. He thought of his wife, Sarah, trapped somewhere in that hell, and felt rage fill his chest like molten metal. These aliens had made a critical error. They had mistaken humanity's peaceful nature for weakness. "Rodriguez, do we still have access to the fusion reactor's control system?" "Yes, sir." "The manual override is still functional." James smiled grimly. During the border wars, he had learned that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy was to deny them their victory. "Set the reactor to overload. Maximum yield." "Sir, that will take half the colony with it, along with every Zephyrian in the blast radius," James confirmed. "Sometimes the best you can do is make them pay for their victory." Rodriguez nodded and began entering the override codes. Around them, the other security officers took up positions, their faces grim with understanding. They were about to die, but they were going to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. As the first Zephyrians flowed through the breach in the command center's walls, James Mitchell raised his weapon and thought of his wife's smile. "For New Eden," he whispered, and opened fire. The fusion reactor's detonation could be seen from orbit, a brief, brilliant star that incinerated everything within a 50-kilometer radius. Zephyrians and humans died together in the atomic fire, their screams lost in the roar of unleashed energy. It was the kind of destruction that New Eden's founders had sworn to leave behind, but in the end, it was the only language the galaxy understood. Elena Vasquez felt the ground shake beneath her feet as the explosion lit up the horizon. She had made it to the colony's edge, where a few hundred survivors huddled in the ruins of what had once been a paradise. The Zephyrians had pulled back from the radiation zone, but they were already adapting, their forms shifting to better handle the contaminated environment. "We can't stay here," she told the group of survivors. "They'll come back, and when they do, we won't be able to stop them." "Where can we go?" asked one of the mothers, clutching her infant to her chest. "The ships are destroyed. The communication array is gone. We're trapped." Elena looked up at the stars, remembering the emergency beacon she had hidden in the mountains during the colony's construction. It was a relic from the border wars, designed to transmit a distress signal across interstellar distances. She had installed it against regulations, never imagining it would be needed. "There's a way to call for help," she said, "but we need to reach the northern mountains." It was a journey of 200 kilometers through territory now controlled by the Zephyrians. Most of them would die before they reached the beacon, but at least Earth would know what had happened to New Eden. They would know that humanity's children had been murdered in their beds by monsters from the dark between stars. As they began their desperate march, Elena looked back at the burning colony one last time. 40,000 people had lived there that morning, and now fewer than 300 remained. The Zephyrians had not just destroyed a world. They had shattered humanity's dream of a peaceful future. But as she watched the alien ships move through the ruins of New Eden, Elena remembered something her grandfather had told her during the border wars. Never mistake our capacity for peace with an inability to make war. The Zephyrians had just learned the difference between sleeping dragons and dead ones. The emergency beacon activated on a cold mountain peak, its signal racing across the void at faster-than-light speeds. Elena Vasquez lay dying beside it, her body ravaged by radiation from the reactor explosion, but her engineer's mind had remained sharp enough to calibrate the transmission. The message it carried was simple. New Eden was gone, and humanity was no longer alone in the universe. The signal reached Earth's outer monitoring stations 47 minutes later, carried by quantum entanglement arrays that had been designed to coordinate peaceful expansion. The technicians who received it at first thought it was a malfunction. The idea that an alien species had committed genocide against human civilians was too horrific to accept. But as the data was analyzed and verified, a terrible truth emerged. The Zephyrians had not simply destroyed New Eden. They had recorded the entire process, broadcasting their victory across hyperspace frequencies as a warning to any other species that might challenge their dominion. The recording showed children being absorbed alive, families torn apart, and 40,000 human beings processed like cattle. President Rebecca Harrison stood in the Situation Room beneath the White House, watching the final transmission from New Eden play on the main screen. She had spent her entire political career advocating for peaceful expansion, for humanity's transformation from a species of warriors to a species of builders. Now, she was watching the price of that philosophy measured in the screams of innocent children. "How many other colonies are at risk?" she asked. "All of them," replied Admiral Chun, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "The Zephyrians have been monitoring our expansion for decades. They know the location of every human settlement beyond the solar system. And our current military capabilities? Minimal. We have a few patrol ships, some orbital defense platforms, and the Martian defense fleet. We're a peaceful species now, Madam President. We don't maintain the kind of forces that could fight an interstellar war." President Harrison stared at the screen, where the last survivors of New Eden were being hunted through the ruins of their world. These aliens had made a critical error. They had assumed that humanity's peaceful nature meant they were weak. They had forgotten that the same species that had built New Eden had also built the weapons that could crack planets in half. "Admiral, I want you to activate the Lazarus protocols." The room fell silent. The Lazarus protocols were theoretical contingency plans for fighting a war that no one had believed would ever come. They involved mobilizing resources and technologies that had been locked away since the end of the border wars, weapons that humanity had sworn never to use again. "Madam President, those protocols would mean total war. We're talking about mobilizing the entire species for conflict." "Then that's what we'll do," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 40,000 dead. The Zephyrians wanted to send a message about what happens to species that defy them. It's time we sent a message of our own. The emergency session of the United Nations Security Council convened within hours of New Eden's fall, but the debate was brief and decisive. The footage from the colony had been broadcast to every human settlement in the galaxy, and the response was universal: rage, grief, and an ancient hunger for justice that had been dormant for decades. The Zephyrians have made their intentions clear. President Harrison addressed the assembly. They view us as a resource to be harvested, not a species to be negotiated with. They have murdered our children, destroyed our homes, and threatened the very survival of our species. We will not, allow this crime to go unanswered. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in human history, the entire species was united in a single purpose: the complete and utter destruction of the Zephyrian Empire. Within hours, the largest industrial mobilization in human history began. Factories that had been producing consumer goods were converted to weapons manufacturing. Shipyards that had been building colony ships began construction on warships. The same technology that had terraformed worlds was weaponized to create devices that could unravel the very fabric of space-time. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the classified research facility beneath the Swiss Alps, where humanity's most dangerous weapons had been locked away since the border wars. He was part of the team that had created the Omega-class antimatter bombs, weapons capable of destroying entire star systems. They had been built during humanity's darkest hour, when the species had nearly destroyed itself in global conflict. The Hegemony Council wants to know how quickly we can resume production, his assistant reported. Marcus looked at the dormant production lines that had been silent for 50 years. Give me 72 hours, and I'll have the first batch ready for deployment. Give me a month, and I'll have enough to sterilize half the galaxy. Sir, the Omega weapons were banned by the Geneva Accords. Using them would make us. The Geneva Accords were written by a species that had never faced extinction, Marcus interrupted. The Zephyrians have shown us what they are, predators who view us as food. We're not going to defeat them with restraint and good intentions. Across the solar system, similar scenes were playing out. On Mars, the Titan shipyards were expanding their production capacity by 3,000%. On Europa, the cybernetics labs were developing new generations of combat enhancers. On Earth, every major military academy was recalling veterans of the border wars, men and women who had hoped never to see combat again. Colonel Sarah Reeves stood in the recruitment center in New Geneva, watching the lines of volunteers that stretched around the block. They were farmers, teachers, engineers, and artists, people who had never known war, but who had seen the footage from New Eden. The Zephyrians had given them a masterclass in why pacifism was a luxury that could only be afforded by the strong. Ma'am, Sergeant Torres approached with a data pad. We've processed over 10,000 applications just today. The response is beyond anything we projected. Sarah nodded, remembering her own recruitment during the border wars. She had been a young idealist then, believing that war was a necessary evil that could be waged with honor and restraint. The Zephyrians had shown her how naive that belief was. This would not be a war of conquest or ideology. It would be a war of survival, and the only rule would be victory at any cost. What's the status on the veteran recall? 93% compliance. Most of the holdouts are requesting reassignment to the most dangerous positions. Sarah understood. The veterans of the border wars had thought they were done with killing, but watching the Zephyrians process human children had reawakened something primal in their souls. They wanted to be on the front lines when humanity's vengeance finally reached the enemy. She thought of her own service record, 12 years of combat in the asteroid belt, where corporations had fought brutal wars over mining rights. She had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. But the Zephyrians had made it personal. They had murdered innocents, and for that, they would pay a price beyond their comprehension. Torres, send word to Fleet Command. The first Terran Expeditionary Force will be ready for deployment in 6 weeks. Yes, ma'am. And the rules of engagement. Sarah looked out at the volunteers, at the faces of people who had lived their entire lives in peace, but who were now preparing to become instruments of war. The Zephyrians had wanted to terrify humanity into submission, but they had instead awakened something that had been sleeping since the end of the border wars. There are no rules, she said. The Zephyrians wanted to show us what total war looks like. We're going to give them a demonstration they'll never forget. The Titan shipyards had been humanity's pride during the age of peaceful expansion, a massive industrial complex that floated in the upper atmosphere of Saturn, building the colony ships that carried human civilization to the stars. Now, as Admiral Chun toured the converted facilities, he saw the machinery of war being born on an unprecedented scale. The first batch of Retribution-class dreadnoughts will be ready in 3 weeks, reported Chief Engineer Nakamura, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. Each one is equipped with quantum torpedoes, antimatter cannons, and adaptive shielding systems. They're designed to fight enemies with technology beyond our current understanding. Admiral Chen nodded, studying the massive vessels taking shape in the construction bays. They were beautiful in the way that apex predators were beautiful, sleek, deadly, and utterly without mercy. The Zephyrians had superior technology, but humanity had something more dangerous: the capacity for total war. What about the Prometheus project? Dr. Webb's team has exceeded all expectations. The new Omega warheads are 30% more efficient than the original designs, and we've solved the containment issues that limited their deployment. A single torpedo can now destroy a small moon. The Admiral felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. The Zephyrians had made the mistake of thinking that humanity's peaceful expansion meant they were weak. They had forgotten that the same species that had built paradise worlds had also built weapons that could crack planets in half. How many ships can we deploy within 6 months? 2,000 capital ships, 50,000 fighters, and enough support vessels to maintain operations indefinitely. The civilian contractors are working around the clock. They know what's at stake. Admiral Chun looked out at the construction yards, where tens of thousands of workers labored to forge the instruments of humanity's vengeance. They were building more than warships. They were building humanity's future as the dominant predator in the galaxy. The Zephyrians think they're hunters, he said. They're about to learn what it means to become prey. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the one who had died on New Eden, had a sister. Dr. Carmen Vasquez stood in the Advanced Weapons Laboratory on Phobos, where humanity's most brilliant minds were creating tools of destruction that would have been considered war crimes during the border wars. The moral calculations had changed when the enemy began processing human children as food. The singularity bombs are ready for field testing, she reported to the assembled military leaders. Each device can create a localized black hole with a radius of 50 kilometers. The gravitational effects will tear apart anything within 1,000 kilometers. General Morrison, scarred veteran of the border wars, shook his head in amazement. In my day, we thought nuclear weapons were the ultimate expression of destructive power. The Zephyrians forced us to think bigger, Carmen replied. They have technology that can manipulate matter at the quantum level. We needed weapons that could affect reality itself. She activated a holographic display showing the test results. A small asteroid had been chosen as the target, and the singularity bomb had not simply destroyed it. It had erased it from existence, leaving only a perfect sphere of twisted space-time that would persist for millennia. How many can we produce? With current manufacturing capacity, we can build 500 per month. But, General, I need to stress that these weapons are beyond anything we've ever created. Using them will fundamentally change the nature of warfare in the galaxy. General Morrison thought of the footage from New Eden, of families being torn apart by alien monsters who viewed humans as livestock. The Zephyrians had already changed the nature of warfare. They had made it personal. The enemy has shown us what they are, he said. Now we're going to show them what we can become. President Harrison stood before the joint session of Congress, her face carved from stone as she delivered what would become known as the Declaration of Species War. The chamber was packed with representatives from every human world, their faces reflecting the same mixture of grief and rage that had consumed the species since New Eden's fall. The Zephyrian Empire has declared war on humanity through their actions, she began, her voice carrying across the chamber and to every human settlement in the galaxy. They have shown us that there can be no coexistence, no negotiation, no peaceful resolution to this conflict. They view us as food, and they will not stop until every human being in the galaxy has been processed and consumed. The silence was absolute. These were people who had lived their entire lives believing that war was a relic of humanity's past, but the recordings from New Eden had shattered that illusion forever. The Zephyrians made a fundamental error in their calculations, she continued. They assumed that our peaceful nature meant we were weak. They forgot that the same species that built the gardens of New Eden also built the weapons that ended the border wars. They have awakened something that has been sleeping for 50 years, and they will discover that humanity's capacity for destruction is limited only by our imagination. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the assembly. I am hereby authorizing the use of any and all weapons in humanity's arsenal. The Omega protocols are active. The Prometheus project is operational. Every resource of our species will be committed to the complete and utter destruction of the Zephyrian Empire. We will not stop until every world they have claimed is liberated, every ship they have built is destroyed, and every trace of their civilization is erased from the galaxy. The vote was unanimous. Humanity had spent 50 years learning to build instead of destroy, but the Zephyrians had reminded them that sometimes the greatest act of creation was the destruction of evil. The Zephyrian High Command had expected fear, submission, and perhaps desperate attempts at negotiation. What they received instead was a declaration of total war broadcast across every frequency in the galaxy, accompanied by weapons signatures that their sensors could barely comprehend. Overlord ZYXDH floated in the crystalline chamber of the flagship Harvester of Worlds, its consciousness linked to every ship in the Armada. The conquest of a human colony had been perfect, a demonstration of Zephyrian superiority that should have terrified the remaining human settlements into submission. Instead, the prey had become predators. "Show me their fleet movements," it commanded, and the tactical display lit up with data that defied comprehension. Where the Zephyrians had expected to find a few dozen patrol ships, they were now tracking the largest military mobilization in galactic history. Over 2,000 capital ships, each one equipped with weapons that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. "How is this possible?" demanded Sub-Overlord Cathare. "Our intelligence indicated that the humans had dismantled their military forces decades ago." "They lied," the YXDH replied, studying the human fleet compositions. "They allowed us to believe they were weak while they prepared for war. We have been deceived." The tactical display showed human forces moving through hyperspace with impossible speed, their destinations clearly marked. Every Zephyrian outpost, every conquered world, every strategic asset the Empire had built over millennia of expansion. This was not a defensive response. It was a war of annihilation. "Overlord, we are receiving transmissions from the human fleet. Shall I translate them?" "Yes." The message was simple, broadcast on every frequency in every human language. For New Eden, no survivors. ZYXDH felt something it had never experienced before: fear. The humans were not coming to negotiate or to rescue their captured colonies. They were coming to exterminate the Zephyrian species, and they had built weapons specifically designed for that purpose. "Recall all fleets to the core worlds," it commanded. "Activate all defensive systems. And send a message to the other overlords. We are facing extinction." The Battle of Kepler 186 marked the beginning of humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. Admiral Chen's fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, their weapons already charging as they accelerated toward the Zephyrian stronghold. The enemy had fortified the gas giants' moons, turning them into massive weapons platforms that could destroy entire fleets. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen." His voice echoed across the fleet's communications network. "The Zephyrians chose to make war on our children. Today, we show them the price of that decision." The Zephyrian defense fleet moved to intercept sleek, crystalline vessels that seemed to bend light around them. They were beautiful, elegant, and utterly unprepared for what humanity had become. "Prometheus Squadron, you are cleared for weapons release," Chen commanded. The first Omega torpedo struck the Zephyrian flagship, and for a moment, the laws of physics seemed to scream in protest. The antimatter warhead didn't simply explode, it created a brief rent in space-time itself, a wound in reality that consumed everything within a 50-kilometer radius. The Zephyrian ship, with its crew of thousands, simply ceased to exist. "Holy shit,"